Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Thank you very much for attending this webinar, which is looking at one of our very important and strategic neighbors, that is Myanmar, and looking at the India-Myanmar relationship in the context of the overall regional situation, a regional situation where the impact of the rise of China, its emergence as the second largest economy in the world, perhaps the second most powerful country in the world after the United States of America. This is beginning to have a major impact on the security calculations, political calculations of virtually all the countries in the region. And Myanmar is no exception. But perhaps it is worthwhile to look at this relationship in a somewhat historical perspective. Number one, there has been a long history of, in fact, a degree of tension between China and Myanmar, which stretches back almost to the time of Myanmar's emergence as an independent country, where the Chinese influence was very much exercised through its linkages with several of the ethnic groups which are ranged around the periphery of Myanmar. Some of those ethnic groups have also inter-ethnic links with groups on the other side of the Chinese border. But these were, during the early years, they were sort of grouped together under the Burmese Communist Party, the BCP. And China sort of utilized these linkages to essentially keep a constant pressure point on the central government in Myanmar. Perhaps, some of those linkages have been transformed, have changed over the years, but that basic use of these ethnic groups as an instrument of influence, that has not really changed in essence. So that is one aspect of China's influence. There is also in more recent years, the economic linkages between the two countries, and China has very consciously, not just recently, but I'm going back as far as the mid 80s, when the border trade was opened up between China and Myanmar, and became a very important part of the economic linkages between the two countries. And thirdly, of course, has been the political aspect, which is to really utilize what may have been short-term political opportunities in Myanmar to put in place what I call long-term assets of influence, so that even though there may have been changes in government in the recent past, as there has been, with the change in leadership, not fully, but some change in leadership, transition from a purely military government to one where the military continues to play a very important role, and yet you have some democratization which has taken place. A civilian government has come into existence. We just have had the recent elections, the second elections under the new constitution, and it would appear that the National League of Democracy under Aung San Suu Kyi is probably going to once again win a majority, probably a two-thirds majority, which will enable it to have some degree of balance with a very powerful military. But through all these transitions which have taken place, if you look at the longer-term secular trend, this has been one of China being able to maintain a very, very significant influence in Myanmar, much more significant than what we have seen in the previous millennium and in the early years of this century. So that is the kind of setting, and of course, this means also what is the challenge for India. And we have two very, very distinguished panelists to to really unpack some of these issues. We have Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, who also, like me, has also served as ambassador in Myanmar. And we have Professor Avinash Paliwal, who has also been doing a lot of research in the political situation in Myanmar and the regional context. So both of them will be able to tell us a great deal about how we should see the changing nature of Chinese influence in Myanmar. What are its implications for India? What are the ways in which, despite the fact that we cannot match China's economic capabilities, its security capabilities, what are the ways in which India can at least serve as some kind of a significant countervailing power in Myanmar? These are some of the questions that we will be looking at. So without any further ado, let me first turn to Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay and request him to give us his perspective on some of the questions that we have raised. Gautam, you have the floor.
Right. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to thank Ambassador Ashok Kant for inviting me to this event. It's really an elite forum to be able to speak on. Ambassador Sir, Shyam Saran, I could not have expected a better moderator, and also thank you very much for your introduction that I think just sets the context for the thing. I'd also like to thank Avinash Paliwal for joining me. I think Avinash's book interests seem to coincide with my postings for some reason. But I think it will be, of course, all the more enlightened by that. And of course, the very quality audience that we have in the ICS. I recognize many faces. My personal greetings to all of them. I really do appreciate, the great work that the ICS is doing in promoting, knowledge of China and India. Really all the better to deal with our very large and sometimes overbearing neighbor. So, it's actually tempting to start with commenting on the title and also to go back a little bit into history. But, I fear that if I started that, I would probably run out of time even before I came to the present. So I think I'll leave questions of history and others to Avinash, or perhaps the question and answer session. And I will actually come pretty much to the last 10 years, that is the period of the USDP government, and just very briefly touch on the history before that. By and large, I think we can say that, in the first part of the relationship, that is starting from 1948, China was just had its revolution in 1949. Its primary concerns were to consolidate its revolution, root out the Kuomintang that was sort of present in large sections of northern Myanmar, as well as settle its boundaries. And so you had Burma at that time actually preempting, this question about the Kuomintang by recognizing, in fact, being the first non-socialist country to recognize China, the Socialist Government of China, the Communist Government of China, the PRC at that time. In fact, UNU actually spoke to Nehru. Nehru was about to recognize the PRC himself. UNU spoke to him saying that, no, we'd like to be first. So Nehru actually conceded. UNU recognized the PRC first, and then Nehru followed. And the whole idea was that to preempt, Chinese claims that in due course, if they would rout the Kuomintang, that they should not actually claim those territories on which historically China had laid some claim in the past. And so, they recognized the PRC in December 1949. In 1950, they established diplomatic relations. This year technically was the 70th year of that. In 1954, they, signed up, they announced the Panchsheel, which was a statement on Chinese part, because it was basically trying to say that, party relations and government relations can be kept separate. And then in 1960, they settled and ratified their boundary, and they also signed a treaty of peace and mutual non-aggression. And under that treaty, they also conceded any claims that they had, particularly on Kachin State at that point of time. So relations appeared cordial on the surface of it, but deep down, there was always a degree of mistrust and suspicion. The Chinese, A, felt that the Myanmar were not revolutionary enough, and B, that even as they professed friendship, they were always looking around for others. They were looking around for other countries to balance balance China with. And they were particularly suspicious of the United States and Myanmar's relations with the United States. And they tried to take care that Burma would not go towards the SEATO and the US-led alliance. So even though Burma was not inclined to do so, that suspicion was there. And from the Myanmar side also, there was a suspicion about Chinese intentions, about their use of ethnic Chinese in the domestic politics of Burma at that time, and also about the activities of the Communist Party of Burma. Now, initially, in keeping with the Panchsheel Agreement, the Chinese did not formally sort of intervene or interfere too prominently in Burma's affairs through the Communist Party of Burma. They actually worked through other pro-Chinese and leftist parties who were, in fact, former officials of the Communist Party of the Burma, the National United Front. And in the 1956 elections, in fact, UNU complained to Zhou Enlai that these elements were interfering with the elections and, in fact, taking sides of Chinese interests. But in 1960, it was the other way around. By that time, the Anti-Freedom League, the AFPFL, that Aung San founded, that had split into two camps, one camp with U Ba Sui and one camp with UNU. UNU's camp was called the Clean faction. And it was U Ba Sui's turn to complain to Zhou Enlai again that China was interfering on behalf of UNU. And in fact, China was cultivating UNU at that time, partly to be able to settle that boundary that it had been working for, which was done in 1960. 1962, the coup took place. With Nevin's coup, there was, relations deteriorated. I mean, firstly, I think, Nevin had a kind of xenophobic and anti-foreigner stance. In 1967, riots broke out, anti-Chinese riots broke out. About 100,000 ethnic Chinese and expatriates had to leave. And diplomatic relations were, in fact, broken off. And relations continued like this. This was at this time that China officially fully supported the Communist Party of Burma. From then until about 1988, this support was open and clear. In fact, for about 15 years, the Communist Party Burma operated from Shan State. For 15 years, Shan State was virtually out of their control. And this was a kind of, a serious sort of disruption of the Myanmar-Chinese relationship. Border trade was stopped, though smuggling continued. In 1985, the Chinese invited UNU. Relations started improving. 1988, the students' demonstration, the international isolation, and particularly after 1990, when the elections that the NLD won were annulled, literally threw once again the Burmese into Chinese hands. And they remained in Chinese hands through the entire period after that. That is after the Nevin government to the SLOC regime, and also the SPDC regime that followed until about 2011. But at the time that I came, and during this period, actually the relationship slightly changed. Until about 2000, most of the relationship was political, where the Chinese were trying to ensure their interests in Burma, both domestic interests through the Communist Party of Burma as well as the ethnic Chinese, and their international interests by trying to keep Burma away from any kind of Western and US-led camp. But by around 2000, their interests started becoming much more economic. In 2007, they signed up for the Myitsone Dam. Work had been on it even before that. They started investing in mining activity. The Let Padang Tong copper mine was a major investment. But at the time that after the 2010 elections, 2011, when U Thein Sein's USDP government, the USDP government came into power, they were extremely uncomfortable about their relationship with the Chinese. In fact, that discomfort went back. And in 1987, when Rajiv Gandhi went to Burma, in fact, he got quite a cold reception. But by 1994, 1995, Senior General Thanshay was beginning to respond much more openly to our Look East policy. And in fact, that was the time that the friendship road that between Tamu and Kalay was constructed. I think Ambassador Shamsaran would be able to tell you about the kind of openings that were established with General Monge, who was the number 2 in command at that time. Than Shwe himself paid a visit in 2004. He appointed his personal nominee as ambassador in India. And, this kind of balanced things started. They also offered India projects like the Tamanti and the Shwezae projects. So I think there was a period of warming that, that coincided with their trying to distance with the Burmese, with the Chinese. By the time 2011 came, I think the reformist section of the military were more or less clear that this old relationship was not working. They decided to diversify their relations. They strengthened their relations with ASEAN. They reached out to India as well. I think U Thein Sein, one of his first visits for India, and they made this remarkable opening internationally and domestically, politically. Political prisoners were released. Aung San Suu Kyi was released. Media freedoms were permitted. Restrictions were relaxed. Political association was allowed. And internationally, I think one of the first acts that Thein Sein did was to suspend the Myitsone Dam. Now, Myitsone Dam had been signed in 2007. It was an extremely unpopular project. It was to be constructed at the confluence of the 2 tributaries that form the Irrawaddy, so highly symbolic value. And there was both ethnic as well as nationalistic, all down the Irrawaddy River opposition to that. The media freedoms that were allowed these sentiments to come out. And then Thein Sein used those sentiments to actually completely surprise the Chinese by announcing the suspension of the Myitsone Dam. And during the time that I reached there, which was in 2014, from 2014 to 2015, that is the end of the USDP government, the USDP, the one country that I know that kept the Chinese off balance was the USDP of Myanmar. So they pushed them back on Myitsone. Another controversial project was the Lek Padong Tong copper mine project. In this case, there were issues of environmental degradation. There were also issues of land confiscation. There was a Chinese company, Wanbao, that was in association with a military company called the UEMHL that was involved in this. Sometime there were agitations and demonstrations against the project. The Myanmar security forces used white phosphorus grenades. About 100 people, including mostly monks who were protesting, got burnt in that. The parliament instituted a commission to look into it. That commission was headed by Aung San Suu Kyi. And basically Aung San Suu Kyi and that, pretty much let off the Chinese. In fact, the end result of the thing was that the Chinese were allowed to continue. Terms were slightly negotiated, but they were allowed to expand. And it was justified mostly on the grounds of that, this was a commitment that had been made and it was a very important relationship and it must continue. So this is more or less what happened through that period. They took Chinese help when they needed it, but internationally they've now had relations with Japan, the US, the West. And in fact, these all added up to Chinese issues against the Myanmar government that, for example, in the peace process, which they had unleashed, the Europeans and the Americans, as well as the Japanese, were involved. And therefore they were establishing contacts with many of the ethnic armed groups very close to the Chinese border. In fact, I see Ambassador Vijay Nambiar here. He was at that time the UN SRSG for Myanmar. He used to often visit, and I think probably no one knows that story better than him. So I hope he will comment on this a little later. So there were a number of these projects that were going on at that time. So essentially, the Chinese were able to use the 2015 elections. They prepared for it. I think Myitsone was a big shock. After Myitsone, they started broad-basing their relations. Until then, they had more or less left things to the Tamado and to the USDP. And they really hadn't bothered to cultivate other sources. Though they kept, in 1990, their ambassador had met Aung San Suu Kyi. And also in 2010, after the elections, their ambassador actually called on Aung San Suu Kyi. But in 2015, they started reaching out to her much more formally. There were issues, there was the Kokang issue. In June, she was formally invited to China, even before she was elected. She was formally invited to China. She was received by Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People, which is normally reserved for state visits. She also met Li Keqiang. And I think the relationship was established at that time. There were Also party-to-party relations. NLD delegations started going to China. Basically, they saw that she had popular support. They claimed a relationship of her mother with Zhou Enlai, or at least they invoked that relationship to start building a better relationship. Her position on the Let Padang Commission issue also helped. And soon after the elections, in fact, one very important thing happened during this period. During this period, the USDP period, as part of its economic opening, they had announced 3 special economic zones. One of them was at Chofu. Now, the Chofu tender had gone to a Chinese consortium headed by CITIC, but the USDP government sat on it until the time of the elections. In the period between the elections, which they lost, and the new government and the new parliament took over, that means before March when it took over, sometime in January, the contract for the Chofu special economic zone was actually handed over to the Chinese. And in fact, I actually remember a senior Myanmar minister telling me that they would like to see how Aung San Suu Kyi manages to handle the Chinese. They took some pride in the fact that they had managed to keep them a little off balance. In any case, it was a decision taken by the old parliament, that is the parliament that was where the USDP had a majority, and she was landed with it. So soon after she took over in 2016 March, the first visitor was Wang Yi. I think we would have also sent Sushma Swaraj, but by that time I think she was ill, so she was not able to do so, and I think we had some other compensatory visits. But the long and short of it was that this was the time that they also started unrolling the BRI. So Aung San Suu Kyi was invited to China for the BRI. In 2017, they entered into an MOU on the BRI. And simultaneously, Chinese had concluded that the Chofu special economic zone was not enough for them. In fact, in 2015, Chinese proxies, business proxies, had started reaching out to us to tell us that, this is not enough. We actually need a much larger kind of project in Burma. We need transport and communication networks from Yunnan to Chofu. We need connectivity inside Myanmar up to Yangon. So all this then built up into the kind of BRI package. And the BRI package consisted of the following. First, of course, were the oil and gas pipelines that were already inaugurated in 2014, 15, 16, I think between 15 and 16. Then the special economic zone that was given to them in 2016. Then, along with that, and it was never very clear whether it was part of it or not, but they started work on the Chofu Deep Sea Port project. Now, the Chofu Deep Sea Port is probably the single best natural harbor in this area. But it was something that obviously the Chinese had got a lock in because it was never ever offered to anyone else. So this is the time they actually adopted the Deep Sea project. It was originally supposed to be a 7 billion investment, but I think by this time, Aung San Suu Kyi had begun to read the writing on the wall and see what had happened in places like Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And they reduced the investment, bargained it down from 7 billion to about 1.3 billion. But alongside that, they came up with a whole number of other packages. For one, there was the Mandalay-Muse railway line. The Mandalay-Muse railway line was already, there was an MOU signed with the USDP before that, but that expired in 2015, so they revived that. There were all kinds of connectivity projects from Mandalay to Yangon, as well as from Mandalay via Metila to Chofu. Then there were a whole series of border economic cooperation zones that were in principle agreed to. That was along the China-Myanmar border, Ruili, Muse, a place called Chinsei Ho, and others, and the new Yangon real estate project. So in all these projects, of course, a large number of ethnic Chinese as well as Myanmar business.
Gautam, can you finish in about 5 minutes, please? Otherwise, we will not be able to.
In fact, 2-3 minutes. So these were the official projects. But side by side with the official projects, there were 2 other kinds of investments that were going on. One was, of course, a lot of private investment. A lot of private investment, much smaller. Some of it was in mining, small-scale mining, but a lot of it was in plantation agriculture, some of it in manufacturing. Of course, the degree of informal trade that was going on through Muse was extraordinary. In fact, I've personally seen people carrying dismantled, and even full motorcycles on the back of their own motorcycles with a pillion rider. So, trade used to be, so if official border trade is, let's say, about 4 or 5 billion, the informal trade is likely to be equally that. So there was a lot of, and plantation agriculture involved tissue culture bananas, particularly in Kachin state and, the areas like Wa and Mongla, which were practically sort of colonized by China. I've personally visited some of those places. The economy is entirely integrated to that of China. Mongla, for example, is in fact a casino city for the Chinese, also frequently called a Sin City, a place where there's a lot of wildlife trade and a lot of other things. There's a lot of illegal trade involved in this: timber, jade, cattle, but also drugs and wildlife. And then there are these gray zone projects, a number of real estate projects that are coming up both on the frontier, but also on the the Thai border at Miyawadi. One particularly large investment, which is called the Shui Koko investment. Officially, it is supposed to be a very small investment, a high-end real estate development project. But in fact, in their literature, is billed as a 15 billion international city. 15 billion investment on an international city. It carries the name of, it's called Yatai International. It carries the name of another Chinese government company called Jilin Yatai. So there is a confusion whether it's an official project or not. They brand themselves as a BRI project. One of the Chinese companies, public companies called, I think, China Metallurgical Corporation, has a subsidiary which is actually doing the construction work there. And there are thousands of white-collar China workers involved in that. So here is a kind of gray area project that's actually a private investment, but that's latched onto the BRI label and is, again, basically building on a gray zone, tie-ups with the border guard forces in that area, who are mainly Karen border guard forces. So, these are some of the ways that it has been operating. Also on the political side, there have been, I think Ambassador Shyam mentioned about the ethnic armed organizations, very close ties with most of the non-signatories to the nationwide ceasefire agreement of 2015. And I think finally one further point that on the political side, they broadened their relations. They established, extremely cordial relations with the NLD, official MOU with the USDP. In a way, as far the time being is concerned, they know that Aung San Suu Kyi has the popular support and they have put their bets on her. But at the same time, they have a longer, more strategic MOU with the USDP, which they don't actually have with the NLD. And that's partly because they felt that the USDP has a strong, kind of party base inside that. So I think these are some of the ways that China influences. One is through the International Liaison Department of the Communist Party. It operates with the political parties, through the government, through the military, and of course, a lot through the economic projects and the tie-ups that they have, sometimes with ethnic militias and sometimes with other Chinese business people. So now there's a reaction to this. And I'll just end with that. I think I mentioned the case of the scaling back of the Deep Sea project. The Mutson Dam, they have not been able to get started. The decision on that has been delayed. There were a number of early harvest projects that were released at the time of President Xi Jinping's visit to Myanmar in January 2020 to actually commemorate the 70th anniversary of their relations. But only 3 of some 30-something projects have been allowed, nothing major. In fact, most of them, the Myanmar have adopted a kind of strategy of, insisting on studies and reports and framework agreements. And they are looking very closely at transparency and accountability aspects of these projects. And these are some of the ways that they have kept the Chinese a little off. This is, of course, in the context of their return to Chinese dependence post the Rohingya crisis in 2017. Well, once again, all the diplomatic breakthroughs that were made during the USDP government were upset by this. Once again, Myanmar was thrown into China's hands. Once again, China has used that very transactionally. It has traded its support and its protection for Myanmar in the UN Security Council and elsewhere in return for quid pro quo economic returns. And the economic returns are, of course, trying to project its strategic interest in a kind of two-ocean power, access to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean, Of course, economic stranglehold, if possible, on China, and other corollary benefits that it may get, whether it is vis-a-vis India or vis-a-vis access into the corridors of power in Myanmar. So I think
I think we'll have to stop here, because we are running out of time. Okay. So thank you very much. I think from the excellent presentation that you have made, it is quite clear that we have a very strong and entrenched sort of influence of China in Myanmar. There may have been some ups and downs, as you pointed out, in the relationship. But we are looking at the current situation. There is very little doubt that if there is a power which is dominant in Myanmar, it is China. Yes, we are very conscious of the fact that the Myanmaris themselves are wary of this influence, both for historical reasons, but also I think there is, whether it is the armed forces, Myanmar armed forces, or whether it is the civilian political leadership. I think you have had this experience, I have had this experience too, that you have they do not wish to be so heavily on just one part. And that was also the reason why, at least during the period that I was ambassador there, that there was a receptivity to initiatives which we were trying to take at that time in order to engage with the military junta, to try and see whether we could build up a stronger relationship with the regime, and actually it paid dividends. I recall at that time, Aung San Suu Kyi was not the kind of policies that we were following with respect to Myanmar, and she had in fact complained about this, that India was not really standing up for the democratic forces in Myanmar. But as we have seen, she herself has had to make a sort of a compromise with the military rulers. And we have this uneasy kind of a balance today between the military government and Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD. It is very good that once again she has emerged as the undisputed civilian political leader in the country, because this gives her a degree of room for maneuver, and it also gives her a certain room for maneuver vis-a-vis China. So I think in that context, it is very important to to try and establish a strong relationship with Myanmar, because this is critical. It is critical because we share a 1,400 kilometer long border with Myanmar. 4 of our most sensitive, northeastern states are ranged around this border, starting with Arunachal. You have Nagaland, you have also Manipur and Mizoram. These are all very, very sensitive states as far as India is concerned. We still have the issue of, insurgency in these, and where the cooperation of Myanmar becomes very critical in our ability to try and manage this internal security situation. Not only that, as Gautam has pointed out, that China has been very interested in Chokpyu, which is a very important deep water port in the region. And as far as Bay of Bengal is concerned, which is a critical ocean space for India, if there is going to be a strong Chinese position on the coast of Myanmar facing India's eastern seaboard, that could be a major issue for us. But things are actually creeping in that direction. Yeah. Important for us to establish some kind of I would say, realistically speaking, a countervailing presence. It means, how do we expand the room for maneuver that Myanmar itself can have vis-a-vis China? It is not realistic for us to be able to push China out. I don't think that is realistic. But whether we can, as a major country in the region, we can provide a strong presence in the country in terms of economic relationship, in terms of political, military relationship. We have gifted a submarine to the Myanmar Navy. We have been doing a lot of training for their armed forces. So all these are ways in which we are trying to say, you have an alternative if you wish to utilize that alternative. And I think that's a sensible position for us to take, because, as I said in the beginning, we have to contend with the fact that in terms of sheer capabilities, we are not in a position to match what the Chinese are able to bring to the table. Gautam has, spelled out what we are up against, in a sense. Now I would turn to Avinash to please tell us, given this situation and his reading of the situation, where does he see, opportunities for India or openings for India to be able to at least fend off some of the vulnerabilities that might arise if we were not able to do a good job in managing our relationship with Myanmar? So, Avinash, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sir. And first of all, let me say I'm deeply delighted and honored to be here this afternoon and be presenting on a project that is still ongoing, to be honest. It's a book project that I'm working on, India's strategic history with Myanmar, in front of such an august, such an elite kind of audience. And to Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, Ambassador Kantha, for having me here this afternoon. It's my first time at ICS. I'm really happy about that. Now, I'll not be repeating, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay and Ambassador Saran has given a very comprehensive outlook about both the historical aspects of China's role in Myanmar as well as the contemporary realities. The key point, as far as I'm concerned, when I'm looking at this relationship or this triangle, so to say, is this point, and it's an important point to take away, that China has a lot of influence in Myanmar, but it is also deeply unpopular at a public level. That's something that offers room for maneuver to India to a certain extent, and I'll come to it in a second. Yes, China has multiple tools of leverage and influence over different stakeholders in Burmese kind of polity. But one thing which I felt, and I felt this consistently during my fieldwork in Myanmar, was that whether it is in the regions where there are ethnic minorities, whether it's in the north, whether it's in east, west, or as well as central Myanmar, there is considerable mistrust, there's considerable, doubt about Chinese intention. And that is something which is very important to take away. I also have worked previously in Afghanistan, and I've realized that this public perception is very potent in kind of, making the presence of a country perhaps enduring or not in a strategic sense over a long period of time. India's approach, of course, we'll come to that in a second, has become increasingly cohesive. It's become increasingly focused on trying to be the alternative, if not in a fundamental sense, but be the alternative that people in Myanmar, the government in Myanmar, has been looking at. Now, what I want to lay out today, without going into too much detail, instead of looking at India's relationship with Tatmadaw or with Aung San Suu Kyi, which Ambassador Mukhopadhyay has already done, I want to use the example of the peace process or the insurgent ethnic armed landscape of Myanmar historically. And I want to talk a little bit about the microeconomies on the border region to show how this kind of relationship between people of Myanmar as well as Chinese and Indian presence in the region, in the country, really pans out and has panned out. And I think history to that effect is very telling. We have solutions to this challenge in our own history, in our own relations with Myanmar, and something that we can perhaps learn from. So let's look, if I first of all focus on the economic aspect of it. There is, as has been laid out, a lot of strategic heavy investment by China, especially since 2014-15, whether it's Metso Dam, whether it's the Mandalay Muse Railway, the largest China-Myanmar economic project, connectivity project, within the rubric of Belt and Road, is focused quite a lot on heavy projects. But one thing which I note, and I think is of much more consequence in terms of offering China the levers of manipulation, so to say, especially as far as the ethnic armed groups are concerned, is the microeconomic kind of dependencies that it has created in the border regions of Myanmar. you look at where the salt is coming, where the pencils are coming, where the pins are coming, where the small day-to-day, products of day-to-day livelihood are coming in Kachin state, in Wa. Of course, Wa is a different story in the sense that it uses the renminbi, and it's almost a kind of a quasi-statelet with Chinese support. But even other Shan state, in Wa state, parts of Rakhine, you can see in the local bazaars on the streets, the Chinese presence is felt in that sense. And I think that has much more strategic salience as far as China's grip over Burmese economy goes. And I think this is something that really, Ambassador Saran asked a question: what is it that, what opportunities do India have in doing so? I think apart from the larger projects that we are talking about, whether it's the Kaladan multimodal project, the port and Sightway, there are various things that we have been planning and trying to deliver on. I think making sure that India's northeast is better connected to the border regions of Myanmar, economically speaking, would be very important. Of course, there has in the past few years, there's very clear move towards managing or towards opening, enabling that kind of cross-border trade, which, to be honest, stands something between 4 to 5%. If you look at India-Myanmar bilateral trade, only 5% of it happens over land, it's on land. The rest of the trade happens through maritime networks. So, which is fine, which has to be there, which has to be cultivated, which has to be developed. But in that space where there are huge demographies in sensitive regions of various states of Arunachal, as well as Chin, Sagaing, and Kachin state, I think that kind of economic connectivity would be of much use, both to, of course, northeastern side, but also to people on the other side of the border. That gives us a room to enter, not in a very substantial way, in the sense the way China has entered the BRI. I think that is something that would be left to the Kaladan, the big connectivity projects. But it makes India felt in a day-to-day level much more so than it has been felt today. When I travel to Rakhine, for instance, when I travel to Chin, you see that, yes, there is an idea of India that, okay, yes, India is a neighbor. We have, especially the people in Chin, they will be talking about Mizoram. But then you see that these relationships go back to the 80s and 90s, and then there is a gap. They will talk about these relationships, but they'll also talk in terms of memory. They will not be talking about, yes, we have family members, or we have ethnic kin on the other side whom we meet regularly. That is not a story that I heard on the ground. And I think changing that, it's a small step, but I think it's a more effective step as far as India's kind of presence is concerned. So this economic connectivity, I think we have to bridge the gap to some extent between the larger Act East or Look East policy as we have envisioned, and the larger connectivity projects, as well as something more grounded, smaller projects. And on that note, I should also mention, as far as this economic aspect goes, Look East policy was formalized after the 1990, right? Post 1991, India's economic reforms, and we have a whole new foreign policy approach towards the neighborhood and the world, which is quite dominated by our economic imperatives, which is very good. But you go back to the archives and you see that that was an idea which has been there since independence, perhaps even before. The idea of India's economic connectivity with Myanmar has been a constant feature from the Nehruvian period. Realizing it has been the challenge, mostly because of security reasons, but also, and this is something which I think, especially in New Delhi, there's a scope to do more, more kind of deeper appreciation of that frontier, that region. I think perhaps there's a lot of focus on China, there's a lot of focus on Pakistan, but I think there's scope for much more attention to on-the-ground dynamics of the Northeast and Myanmar, which takes me to the second point. And that is, of course, of the different kind of economies that are operational in this region, and which have a very important shaping. They shape our geopolitical calculus in the region in some very important ways. And that is the illegal economies, right? The drug economies. Then, as small as the legal aspect of India's economic trade with Myanmar is as far as on-land connectivity goes, just as expansive, as huge, as deep are the illegal networks, the illicit networks between these two countries. And of course, it goes up to the Golden Triangle and the larger Southeast Asian kind of drug economies. And this has a very deep effect on how India can manage its relationship, not just with people on the border of Myanmar, but Myanmar itself. I mean, figuring out a way that there is, that these economies are, I'm not saying kind of legitimized, but the economic potential of those connectivities which exist can be capitalized on in a more strategic fashion is something that we can really think about. China, of course, there's, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay mentioned Sin City, but there are various other aspects to Chinese economic connectivity to this region, which is actually, if you think of it from a purely realpolitik perspective, I'm sorry to use that term, they have actually in many ways they have gained control even over the illegal networks of that region, whether it's by outsourcing it through the VA state or through other proxies that they have, individual citizens from China and others. But even in that sphere, you can see that the grip of the People's Liberation Army, the grip of the CPC is quite substantial. Now, as a democracy, it's difficult for India to do that. But I think there's scope to be able to manage the illegal aspects of it. Of course, we have tried quite a lot in terms of reducing drug trades across the border. But I don't think that's not panacea, that's not silver bullet, right? That dynamic, the drug dynamic continues, and then it fuels the kind of insurgencies and the kind of violence, political violence that we see. And that's my third point. And I'll kind of unpack this using the case perhaps of the Kachin Independence Army. 1965, and all these issues are interlinked: economics, insurgency, illegal and legal economies. 1960s, this is just before the Cultural Revolution has begun in China. The Kachin were looking for patrons, this idea of looking outwards to diversify their relationships. At a moment when there is this larger narrative of strategic isolationism coming out of the Tamadaw, especially after the coup in 1962, there was a very intent policy focus on we want to cut our relationships so that with the world powers, so that others cannot manipulate us the way imperial and colonial powers did. And part of the cost of that kind of isolationism at a top level was felt by India, because we also, our own relationship kind of got reduced with Myanmar, coupled with the kind of exodus that was happening of Indians living in the country. Now, at that moment, you see something very unique happen. One, by 1965, General Ne Win, he actually wanted to have very serious relationship, economic, military, strategic, political, diplomatic with India. And with the coming to power of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, you see a very fascinating outreach happening. Ne Win visiting India, really the fundamentals of the India-Myanmar, Indo-Burma boundary treaty, agreement, which was signed in January 1967, gets really kind of instituted at that moment. And at the same time, when the Tatmadaw is trying to reach out to India because there's some serious concern about Chinese ideological push coming from Maoist China at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the Kachin Independence Army reaches out to us. Just when we are fighting a war with Pakistan, the Kachins want to they come, and the idea for them is that, look, India is a democracy. India is a country which has been able to, some extent at least, solve this riddle of managing cultural and social diversity constitutionally, right? Now, this does not mean that they were thinking in those broad terms, but there was clearly a sense in the mid-1960s among one of the most potent ethnic armed organization of Myanmar that we actually want India as our ally in the region and can help facilitate a conversation with Yangon, Rangoon then, instead of having a deeply ideological China, wherein the Kachin will simply become a second kind of, second party or play second fiddle to the Burmese Communist Party, which was, of course, in which China had strategically invested. India said no to that outreach for very good reasons. Of course, our concerns were that if you start talking to these outfits, that increases anxiety among General Ne Win and the Tamadaw within Rangoon. And I think to make sure that those kind of anxieties or mistrust does not develop against India, we kind of took a step back. And there was also the concern that if you cultivate these groups, there's the problem of the Naga insurgency, which was raging at that point, but also the Mizo insurgency, which had kind of started in 1966, worsening rather than solving. So there were good reasons in 1960s when India did not kind of entertain that outreach. But then we see a very different moment happening. And of course, by 1966-67, KIA was fully strategically dependent on the BCP and the PLA, basically taking succor from China. Post Rajiv Gandhi's visit to, and that's, I think, a fundamental visit to really focus on the cold shoulder, as Ambassador Saran said, that Rajiv Gandhi received in Rangoon in 1987, played a huge role in shaping India's perspective into how to respond to the 888 movement, right? Of course, he's an ideological man. He's a man who really stuck to certain principles, secularism, having democracies. Of course, we can debate the methods and their efficacy, but there was almost an ideological moment that, look, our security, national security in the Northeast, our economic aspirations in Southeast Asia and beyond, they cannot be addressed without acknowledging the political diversity and discontent in Myanmar. And Ambassador Nambiar is also here. He'll be able to shed quite a lot of light even on that, because he was proactively involved in that kind of outreach in China and elsewhere. And that is a moment when there is a decision taken at the PMO level that, look, reach out, engage with all the dissent that is coming out from Myanmar, whether it's the student movement, whether it is the ABSDF and the other groups, the NLD, of course, various political factions. UNU's, I think, daughter was based in India. Than Nu was in India, working for All India Radio, very potent voice, which kind of annoyed the Tamado at that point considerably. But also the Kachins and the various other armed insurgent groups, they reached out to India. Unlike 1965, between 1988 roughly and 92, 93, India actually engaged with them. India engages with them. India gives them arms, of course, unofficially, it gives them arms support, it gives them financial support. And the whole idea is that, look, we are not doing any of this to counter the Tatmadaw. We are not doing this to support your kind of revisionist aspirations, territorially revisionist aspirations. We don't want a Kachin state separately created or a Chin state. So much so that at that point, the leader of the Chin National Front, he would come and he would literally tell the Indian leadership that, look, you might as well take Chin as part of India. We want to be part of India and not part of Myanmar. So those narratives really kick into play. What happens at that point, and this is something very important to remember, the Chinese, China is paying very, very close attention to those kind of Indian maneuvering. By the time India had deepened its conversations with Maran Brang Singh, who was a very charismatic leader of the Kachin Independence Organization at that point, and someone who was willing to hear issues related to inclusivity, was not someone who's really fundamentally pitched against the Tatmadaw and wanted a separate state, would work in a federalist framework, and someone India could really work with. China actually really kind of double-timed the whole organization. They took the money of KIO, promised them weapons, and then disappeared. Literally, this one individual, this one Chinese kind of arms dealer, he took most of the money and just disappeared on direction of China. So you can see how in 65, India's refusal to engage with these groups pushes them towards China. And in 88, 89, India's even limited engagement kind of makes them think in a more kind of inclusive political fashion, something that actually Yangon can do with, Naypyidaw today can do with. Come fast forward to 2011, and we see something similar happen. The ceasefire, which was signed between the Kachins and the Tatmadaw in 1990, early 90, that breaks down. Again, the Kachins senior leaders visit India and they ask for support. But given the larger kind of democracy, the transition that was going on, India says that that kind of support is something that we cannot really promise you. Right? And this is a moment when this is my personal kind of view, and I might be very wrong because it's a project in the making and I'm still researching on this. But that is a moment where India could have really capitalized on bringing these parties to the table. Of course, it's not easy. Of course, they're not going to kind of, deliver on a lot of things, and there's a lot of mistrust. But having those kind of connectivities, even though China uses it as an instrument of leverage, these are entities which are looking for alternatives, viable democratic alternatives which will actually make them figure out a solution which is inclusive, in some sense, a political solution to to these long-running wars, low-intensity conflicts that are going on. And the only country they see that can do this is India. And I'm going to quickly quote, and I'll end after that, is this point made by a serving Kachin Independence Army officer when I was doing fieldwork, was that, look, on Northeast, of course, if you try to kind of engage with us, not in terms of arms and money, give us education, give us, connect Kachin State's economy to India's Northeast and other Indian markets. This is what they were really demanding. They were not saying that, look, give us armed support to fight Tatmadaw and fight our battles. That's fine. They have enough of that. They wanted real people-to-people connectivity, which is a point which I felt is often missed when we talk about the armed organizations, because we suddenly, in the mind of the policymaker, the whole thing gets securitized. But there's much more to those communities which can be capitalized upon as we go forward. Just having human, people-to-people relations, opening up opportunity in that space would take us a long way than we realize, and might not really bring us that much of a cost in our relationship with Tatmadaw. The last point which I want to mention, of course, is that none of this will happen just by building big connectivity projects. A lot of this will have to happen in a bottoms-up way. And I think there's a need from our side to have an asymmetric strategy as far as countering China goes in Myanmar. There is a lot of public uptake for India. No one in Myanmar would view India as a country which is interventionist, or view India as a country that would want to exploit Myanmar. And that's a powerful image to have. The only moment, senior politicians and leaders in Myanmar look back and think of India as interventionist is the early 90s, late 80s moment. And that is also not seen as a hindrance anymore whatsoever, because it's seen as something way much in the past. I think having that conversation with Naypyidaw, that our relationship, whether it's economic, bottoms up, whether it's political, whether it's whatever kind of relationship with border communities, is not to challenge the authority, but to actually help having that conversation in ending this war, in ending this civil war, is really something that we can develop. That's a capability that we don't have. I mean, we have the expertise. We just need to kind of materialize it. Bringing me to the last point of religious nationalism and the conflict in Rakhine. I won't dwell too much into it. All these issues are connected. But one thing that we are in recent times, literally live, the concern is that the Kaladan multimodal project will not, we want it to go ahead, but is unlikely to go ahead because of the conflict situation in Rakhine. I think this particular state of Myanmar is going to be very central as far as the optics and the substance of India's relationship to a considerable level goes, both in terms of dealing with Myanmar itself and China, but also with Bangladesh. We keep forgetting that Bangladesh our relationship with Dhaka is actually something very important when Delhi is thinking about its relationship with Naypyidaw, given the kind of movement, the cross-border migration, forced migration of the Rohingya that has happened over the past few years. And the fact that China has failed to actually get the two sides to substantially take steps on this issue of repatriation is something that we need to very carefully note. This is an area that there would be demands which will be made of India, at least by Dhaka. They have already been made, but this is something that will go on. If this issue is left unresolved as it is, I think we are looking at, that would be a problem that can really become very serious, both in a security sense and otherwise, for Bangladesh as well as for India.
Okay, Avinash, I think you will have to wrap up quickly because we are running out of time.
No, I'll stop right there. The basic point, is, Ambassador Saran, you mentioned what is it, where's the opportunity? I think we should think asymmetrically when we are looking at Myanmar and China. We should not try to match buck for buck. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think that point is very well taken, particularly given the kind of asymmetry that exists between India and China, which is also perhaps going to expand even more. We have to think asymmetrically. There is really no alternative. So thank you very much, Avinash, for giving us that perspective, particularly pointing to some of the ways in which we can try and leverage, points of influence in Myanmar. Also to perhaps think a little bit out of the box in terms of, what we can do to make ourselves more relevant in a sense, not only with respect to Myanmar, but as you mentioned, that there is this issue of, how does our relationship with Bangladesh fit in with, our posture towards Myanmar, and whether we like it or not, there is a certain role that we need to perhaps assume with respect to regional peace, dealing with the Rohingya issue. So I think we have had two very good presentations by Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, also by Professor Avinash Paliwal. And we have maybe perhaps another 10 to 15 minutes where we can perhaps really invite some questions and some comments. Perhaps you can Ashok, if you are there, would you like to moderate the question and answer session? Ashok? I think Ashok is not there. Yeah. So let me. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I had some connectivity problems.
So do you want me to moderate the question and answer session, or would you be able to do it?
Okay. I don't know if am I audible, sir? I had some connectivity.
Yes, issue. You are fully audible. So I would suggest that at least the question and answer session you can perhaps moderate.
Okay, I can do that. So let me begin with inviting Jyoti Malhotra of the Print. They are a media partner. So Jyoti would like to ask a question or two.
Microphone.
And in the meantime, can I request others that please indicate your interest in asking question either in the chat box or by raising hand.
Thank you so much, Ashok. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations, Gautam and Avinash. It was really interesting to hear both of you. Two very quick questions to you, Gautam. It seems to me that over the last several years, at least, that since Aung San Suu Kyi has come to power, that Delhi has been a little hesitant about her. And that always makes me wonder why, we are the largest democracy in the world, etc. But why is it that we are always hesitant about other Democrats or people with democratic credentials? And we seem to prefer the generals in power in Myanmar. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm wondering if you could throw some light on this. And Avinash, to you, the burden of your presentation is how India has such huge opportunities, can do so much, and asymmetric sort of potential. But the point is that the multimodal, the project that we've been doing forever. Then there is that road that is being built from the Northeast to Southeast Asia. That has still not been built. I mean, these things go on and on and on for some reason. So what is the issue? I don't understand.
Okay, Gautam, followed by Avinash. Can you respond?
Yeah, sure. So, I think this question about whether we have a hesitation in dealing with Aung San Suu Kyi, I don't think so. I think let's look at two aspects. One is, what are our interests in Myanmar? One of the first is security in our periphery. And for the security in our periphery, what we actually need are the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Border Affairs, and perhaps the Ministry of Home, all of which are actually under the charge of the Myanmar Army. So we have to deal with them. Secondly, if you just see the constitution, the way the Myanmar army is entrenched in the constitution, at least unless they can change that, there is no immediate sort of sight that the constitution is going to be amended, and in fact, it's going to be a fully democratic, civilized rule. In fact, one could question whether how much Aung San Suu Kyi herself has done to progressively democratize. I mean, to what extent has she deepened democracy? To what extent has she taken any initiative on federalism? which is the other issue I think that was raised by, particularly by Avinash on this whole question of relations with the ethnic, political outfits and groups as well. So I think this is, it's just a pragmatic decision that we have had to make to deal with both. She herself has not been able to push the democratic agenda. She hasn't even shown a great will to do so. I think the basic difference is that with the Myanmar military, it is, power through the coercive apparatus, whereas with her, it is power through people power. But it is not really much more in terms of democratization than that. But by the way, while we are doing that, I think probably we have done more in terms of just technical assistance for the election commission, for the holding of elections in Myanmar. We've had a deep relationship between the Election Commission of India and the Myanmar Election Commission. That is one. But the second thing is that, there have been a number of talks and, there's a whole program on this whole business about federalism. In fact, when Min Aung Hlaing came to India in 2015, in my charge, I remember we had Rathin, who used to head the NIPFP at that time, actually giving a presentation to Min Aung Hlaing on how India has managed its states and elections, and also in particular chief ministers coming from the Northeast region. And I personally brought a number of Myanmar chief ministers to the Northeast. In fact, took them to Nagaland, to Manipur, to Assam, to Shillong, and demonstrated, how this relationship, this federal relationship in India works. And in fact, they took a lot of comfort for it. And the whole idea that you had a central representative in the form of the governor was something that they took great heart from. So I won't say, I think it's a pragmatic compromise that we've had to make, conditioned as much by realities in Myanmar as by our own, ability to influence. I mean, I don't think we ever, starting from 1988, I think we abandoned an activist kind of pro-democracy program. I think that was quite explicit. In fact, Pranab Mukherjee once made a statement on that. We are not in the business of exporting democracy, but we have supported democracy, and the NLD recognizes that, and in fact, if you see the literature coming out of Myanmar today, there's a lot of acknowledgement about India's commitment to democracy as opposed to China's commitment to democracy. All its relationships with the parties in Myanmar have been non-transparent. No press releases, nothing.
Really, thank you for that question. Again, there's no denying that a variety of delays, bureaucratic delays, India's delivery potential, requires, there's much more scope there. We have not been able to materialize a lot of the projects which have very good foundational value, which is something as an idea is very important, as something that must be achieved, is very important, the Kaladan multimodal project, the roads, but there have been a lot of delays, both, on our side, but also let's acknowledge the fact that the terrain through which these projects are going to pass, these are not easy terrains. These are not, and also the economic reward that will come out of Sideway Port has to be limited. I think we need to be very careful with the kind of expectations we put with, these projects, even if I acknowledge completely that the delivery has been slack. And of course, the longer you wait with these projects, the cost increase exponentially over a period of time. How do you make sure that, Sideway Port, which has one kind of, which is a small port, it's not a huge port in terms of capacities, how much economic benefit it can bring in a strategic sense, one, and two, to whom? And I think that is something where my point of asymmetry really comes in. The most important economic kind of fallout implications of these kind of projects will be to the local communities. And I think that is where India's kind of outreach to a lot of the communities in Rakhine, in Chin becomes so important and is perhaps a bit missing. We focus on the big project, but we don't talk to the people enough. And I think that is something that we can really focus on. Of course, we need to deliver fast, but even if my worry is that even if we make the road, even if we build the port which we have, it won't really kick off in a way that many would expect it to, till the time those people-to-people connectivities and exist, that is really worked upon. And I think that's where I'm really coming from, that I think we might be putting too much of a premium on a port or a road when the opportunity lies elsewhere. Thank you.
Well, we have a question from Professor S.D. Muni. Would you like to ask the question, Professor Muni? Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Well, thank you. No, I have a very simple question. I'm quite puzzled as to what is the precise nature of threat which we perceive with the expanding Chinese presence in Myanmar. Not of other neighbors I know, and even in Myanmar, I understand some of these aspects, but because then it will make it clear to us how to confront that. If we know precisely, is it to the business community here, it is to the security establishment here, is it to the ideological or political establishments, or what it is? Thank you.
Who will take that question?
I can take. Avinash, you go first. I can take.
So you go first.
I think threat is a strong word, but if I had to choose one, Professor Muni, it would be the fact that through the CMEC, through the oil and gas pipelines, through the terminals there, through the special economic zone, and through the deep sea port, which is going to be a very large deep sea port, the Chinese will not just have a presence, let's say an economic presence, but they will have very good justification to securitize their assets in the Bay of Bengal. They already have made attempts to securitize the pipelines. In fact, in a visit to Shan, you will actually see signs up saying that this is a friendship pipeline. Please do not damage it. Because there are sort of elements that would like to do that. So I think the first and foremost thing is securitization. With the investments that they have, actually the Chinese would be completely justified to have a security presence in the Bay of Bengal. Now, if you think that is benign, that's fine. But I think that is not going to be taken as benign, particularly if you tie it up with China's other sort of strategic ambitions in the Indian Ocean, the whole notion, idea of being a two-ocean power, and what they intend to do with it. It has not yet happened. I think it's just as well. And it may not happen depending upon whether the projects really take off, because, we are still at an early stage and we don't know what kind of pushback there will be from Myanmar. But if you were to ask me for one possible threat, this would be one. The second is, and I'm glad that I have an opportunity to address this. I agree with everything that Avinash said. But there is one point on this connectivity. What is happening is that all our connectivity projects, actually what they are lending themselves to, and we can argue this in a different location, but in effect, they are actually helping other countries export their products to India. We have not backed our connectivity project idea with productivity of the Northeast. The Northeast, naturally bountiful region, remains net import dependent, net revenue dependent, totally net dependent on the rest of India. And so the kind of trade you're talking about is trade from, let's say, industrial centers like Calcutta or Delhi, through all those extra costs, plus the duty hump that you would have entering the ASEAN Economic Community. You would simply not be able to do that. And in fact, we haven't addressed the trade aspect. I think that the way we are going, there is no way. In 2011, we set a target of 3 billion. In 2020, we are less than 2 billion. And there is no way, unless we think in terms of methods to quantum jump this is not going to happen. So effectively, all the connectivity projects will become bridgeheads for other countries to reach you without you being able to reach. Avinash talked about microeconomies. Just yesterday, I was in a Zoom with the Additional Secretary in the Ministry of Commerce, who was saying that he was disappointed to find that when he crossed over to Tamil, even candies and chocolates were supplied from China. And the answer is very simple. All our distributors should treat Western Myanmar as part of their jurisdiction. There are individual trading cards that they can get. There is a free movement regime. They should just simply start selling their products in that area. But this does not happen in our situation. So we have done this connectivity thing, but we have never really thought, how are we going to use it commercially?
Just one very quick two-finger there. I mean, also, Professor Muni, I think this, apart from the economic well-being of Northeast in the broader region, also the security aspect is not completely resolved. India's Northeast, I mean, the Naga peace accord is still going. Of course, there is a sensibility that it will be signed with or without the IM, especially with the MUIWA on board or not. But a lot of the umbilical cords of these groups also go back to Yunnan. They might not be strategically threatening, I agree today, as they were perhaps in the 90s or 60s, but they still, I mean, China has played an enabler's role in some which way, as by giving people like Hamshik Tangkhul, by giving people like Paresh Barua space to operate from in Yunnan, and often crossing borders into Myanmar, which coming very close to the Indian borders to kind of manage the supply routes, strategic supply routes of arms and finances, illegal, illicit finances to a lot of their cadre on the ground. So that is, I think, in a very immediate sense, in fact, that's something that has an impact on India's kind of national well-being, if that kind of space is allowed for China to kind of develop even more. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinash. I think that was, yeah.
Thank you.
We have a couple of raised hands, Ambassador Suresh Goyal and Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. Suresh, will you go first?
Thank you, Ashok. I have a very brief question. In fact, Gautam has already briefly touched on it. I have had an opportunity to go to Tamil-More border twice, around 2 years ago, to give some lectures at the university in Manipur. And when I went to the border, what struck me was that we have grand projects like ICP at the border in mind, when the roads are not even constructed for the container traffic, and the topography of the land doesn't suggest that it will be so easy to construct. Now, the point really here is that why are we not focusing on the border development projects which can bring the two communities across the border together? Mukho mentioned about trade, and I quite agree really that we can do a lot of trade through the border, through all kinds of consumer products, and replace and at least do a bit of trading there in that area. Why can't we focus on the medical tourism? When I went to the Myanmar side, there were hardly any hospitals worth the name, and they keep on looking for the medical facilities. If we were to develop those facilities on the Manipur side, on the Tamil side, then can we not actually expect more revenue through the medical tourism? Cultural integration. I happened to be there on the day of the Myanmarese New Year, and that's so similar to our holy function. And Manipuri boys, they actually enjoy going over there for the festival. So have you not thought about really this kind of a common border development where people can come together both in trade, culture, medical tourism, etc.? Thank you. This is addressed to Mukho.
Ashok, you want to take some more questions and then we...
Okay, we'll take one more question from Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, then you can respond.
Thank you. My question actually again is to Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, because he mentioned that because of vulnerability that the Myanmar government, particularly Aung San Suu Kyi, actually feels on the Rohingya issue, and the Chinese are actually leveraging it for increasing the strategic sort of leverage on the Myanmar government. I'm just wondering to what extent the Myanmar government is capable of resisting greater pressure, which might happen in the light of the fact that the India-China relations actually are now not in a good shape. And as was hinted earlier, that that the possibility of their using the insurgent card against India, and that would mean that the Myanmar government will come under pressure to allow them to do this kind of thing. And also now that we know that some of the like the Karadan project, Indian workers have been kidnapped by the Arakan army, which I understand also has some links to the Chinese. So I'm wondering to what extent the vulnerability the Myanmar government actually has can be used by the Chinese against us. Thank you.
Ambassador Vijay Nambiar has a comment. Ambassador Nambiar, sir.
I don't have any question. I just have a comment, and that is, if one is to comment on what the two speakers have said, it's going to take a long time. In fact, I'm surprised how much their views are, in a sense, aligned with mine. And I must say that particularly in terms of the ethnic armed groups and the Kachins that Dr. Paliwal was talking about, I'm surprised how their sense of wanting to have links with India is still very, very strong. And I think there is today in today's day and age, as it were, particularly in the context of the recent developments, and particularly in the context of the peace process that has started, even though it has not made very much. If there has been any progress, it has been the progress during the USDP times, and not really during Aung San Suu Kyi's time. But yet, let me tell you, just go back to the March 2013 times, when in fact the UN first came to be involved in the peace process, and that was after the two meetings in Roili, after the Kachin problems with the Tatmadaw, with actually spilt on to China. And it was at that time that the General Aung Min, who was actually leading the peace process on the government side, actually told me. In fact, I was in Myanmar at that time, and I went to Lashio when he returned from Tali, I think, after the talks. And I actually accompanied him on the aircraft back to Naypyidaw. And it was at that time that he had actually mentioned to me that while they had problems with Kachin, they were not very comfortable with having to have peace talks with their own ethnic armed groups in a foreign country. And that's how it started. And they said that they would like to have it inside China, inside Myanmar, and eventually some of the major talks took place in Myitkyina, as you know. And at the first meeting in Myitkyina, in fact, before the first meeting, it was Aung Min who actually mentioned to me that even the Kachins were interested in having observers, not have only China, but they wanted many observers, including USA, UK, but that on the one hand, the Chinese were not very keen on having any outsiders. And on the other, the Myanmar government itself was a little diffident about having too many people in that part of the country. And then that's why he suggested whether the UN will be interested. And it was after my consultations with the US and the UK and others that we were able to agree and became the first actual witnesses or observers to the first round of talks in Myitkyina. And it is interesting, and I don't know whether Avinash, you know, that when the first round of talks were being talked about, and we were supposed to go to Myitkyina, the Chinese had decided not to go, and they were wondering whether the talks would go on at all. And in fact, the first day I actually participated, and Wang Yingfan actually rushed. The second day they came in because they didn't want to be left out. This kind of sense is still there in the army, and it is in a sense a kind of a reflection of the strong sense of nationalism that they have, which, and as both of you have underlined, is so much there. Today, the main fact of the fact that President Thein Sein's announcement of their willingness to accept federalism is something which has not been carried forward as strongly by Aung San Suu Kyi in the talks, even though she seems to want to actually guide the talks in her direction, which is not going to work. And I think now, in fact, if anything, what has happened is the UN has gotten out of the process. The Chinese have actually gotten very strongly entrenched in the process, and the leadership on the ethnic armed group side, as it were, of the peace process itself has almost, I'm not sure whether it's actually done so, but almost moving away from the kind of strong leadership which has been provided by Kachins and even the Karens onto WA, and then the groups which are actually being led by by virtually under Chinese tutelage. And that is going to make a major difference in terms of how the progress of the peace talks will take place. Now, one point which you made about the Chinese by being influential but unpopular is actually very, very patent all through, whether it's in my 3 visits to Liza, even there I could see that. And or in my conversations with the Chinese, with the Myanmar generals, or even with Aung San Suu Kyi. But the fact is, today, the Chinese are in a much better position to actually work, as it were, to slowly to choreograph with the civilian authorities, a kind of movement which will slowly, in a sense, engulf the civilian leadership into the process which the Chinese have brought forward. The army is less willing to do so, and I think it is important, therefore, that we maintain very good relationships with the army. And I think that is probably the point which you've made. And I agree with Mukho when he talks about, you're talking about these micro projects. It seems to be unworkable, mainly because of the point he said that it's most of the projects will be coming into the Northeast rather than going out from the Northeast. But I think that is not a reason why we should not try to encourage people to look at that as a possibility and move forward, because how long are we going to stay like this? I mean, we don't want to build roads in the Northeast because the Chinese may come down there. We don't want to build connectivity with Myanmar because the Chinese goods will come. I mean, how long are we going to behave like this? I think it's important we move a little more. And as you said, asymmetrical sort of avenues should be looked upon. I mean, I don't want to go in further because there's a lot of things which need to be said. But both Sun Guoxiang and Wang Yifan have actually, initially they moved very slowly, but I think particularly the Chinese ambassador in Myanmar was very, very strong, and he's been very aggressive and they've continued to be very aggressive in pushing the line. I don't think I should mention very much else because there's a lot, but I would like perhaps personally to talk to both Avinash and Mukho on this later. Thank you.
Really valuable.
Gautam, Avinash, I think we are running out of time. So very brief responses by both of you.
Very quickly. So I hope nothing that I said was suggestive that, we should stop trade along the border. I think my short point really was that we should have a counter strategy. That counter strategy should be based on, greater productivity of the Northeast and, use the same kind of logic that trade can work both ways. What is happening right now is that trade is happening one way. Second point that you made, I think, and that's a very important point in connection with Yogi's comment. I think the fact is that historically even Myanmar has had a very strong sense of nationalism. And right from the beginning, they have very strongly held on to their principle of neutralism and non-alignment. There is very little chance Myanmar as a body politic of Myanmar keeling over to Chinese pressure, particularly if it affects a third country. And Aung San Suu Kyi, however much she may have been under pressure, and particularly economic and even political pressure, international diplomatic pressure, from to concede things to the Chinese, the fact is that she is no pushover. And I think this should be very clear that both as a personality and as institutions, the Tamador, as well as the body politic of the Myanmar as a people, they have a very strong sense of, we can call it a kind of mini Chinese version of ethnocentrism. And historically, they have pushed the Chinese back. In fact, the Chinese have never actually established any control in Myanmar. The Qing dynasty tried a lot and failed. And I think, Suresh, whatever you said actually more or less substantiates my point. In fact, when the border trade regime was started, it was really started as a measure to bring the two communities together. What actually happened was, in fact, that border trade was being used for third country trade. And at some point, and this is a very important development, when we switched from border trade to MFN trade, because border trade was not working, we did not set up the mechanisms. We created the ICP, but till today, 2 years after its inauguration, no formal trade takes place through the ICP. So you had MFN trade now taking place through informal trade. And the explosion in that trade is so much that I think it is going to be and the people who benefit from it, I think in terms of cuts, the traders, the insurgent groups, even the official agencies, they benefit from this.
In the army.
That it is impossible to crack down on it. In fact, it's very difficult. It requires a lot of political will. I don't say this government does not have the political will, but it does not have the priority right now, because its priority right now is to somehow fix things with the ethnic armed organizations, suspension of operations, etc. This is not the time that they see to crack down on this. But the fact is, in the meantime, this problem is swelling, and it's going to be that much more difficult to enforce your mechanisms. There are many other issues on this, but that's a separate subject. But I think I've dealt with the three questions. Thank you. Sure.
Avinash, any remarks?
No, just very quickly. Thank you so much for the very important points. I won't be talking much more, about the Kachin. I've already spoken, but the point was made about Arakan Army, and given the Kaladan multimodal project and arrests, the hostage taking of some of the engineers, I think, if not Arakan Army, look at the political, the elections have sprung 9 seats to the Arakan Nationalist Party and the Arakan Front Party in the elections. That's something. Arakan Army is not a unit which is bereft of public support in Rakhine. And without that kind of an engagement, you cannot move beyond a point as far as these big projects go. Talk to these political parties. They're legit. They're very much part of the political landscape. And they have very deep connections with the Arakan Army and those constituencies. But those such constituencies, whether it's in Kachin, whether it's in Chin, whether it's in Rakhine, will have to be developed. Thank you so much. I'll stop right there.
Thank you. I'll now request Chair to make a conclusion.
Thank you very much. This has really been quite a fascinating discussion. And, I would only like to reiterate some of the points that I made earlier. And that is really drawn from my 4 years experience in Myanmar. One, I endorse the point that there is very strong sense of nationalism that we find in Myanmar. And this is not only with respect to the Tatmadaw, but also with respect to the Burman majority. And that is something which at that time did create space for us to up our game in Myanmar. And we were able to, from having a somewhat hostile relationship, we were at least able to move to a point where a high-level engagement became possible. And number two, I would like to make the point that we perhaps do not realize how important it is to have a degree of cooperation from Myanmar, particularly from the Myanmar army, in terms of our managing a rather sensitive and insurgency sort of infested region, which is also strategically very important. Now, the Chinese may not be actively engaged in encouraging this insurgency at this point of time, but that always remains a possibility. And what role Myanmar plays in that is going to be critical. Myanmar can facilitate that, Myanmar can prevent that from happening. So I think we should not underestimate the importance of having a good relationship with Myanmar in terms of handling what could become a very major domestic security situation for India. Number three, I would also like to emphasize that if there is an entrenchment of Chinese even economic projects like, for example, Chokpyu, they are also, in fact, eyeing Sittwe. It's not that Sittwe is irrevocably with India. It is not. The Chinese have been talking about, a SEZ around Sittwe, which they would invest in. Of course, they also told us you can also come and invest, but they have made an offer to Myanmar that they would, in fact, develop that SEZ. And I have always believed that, wherever there are strong economic assets which are being put in place, security presence will inevitably follow. I think for us to say, well, this is really economic involvement and we should not get too worried about it, I think that is a very naive kind of assumption to make. If there are going to be strong economic interests that are going to be put in place, rest assured that security interests will follow. And therefore, we should assume that that is what we will be up against. So that is the third point. The fourth point, with regard to how do we deal with this, and reference has been made to, for example, cross-border trade flows, cross-border projects. This is where those hesitations that Vijay mentioned, I think we need to be confronted very, very, directly. Because it does go to what one has always said, that is almost like a security veto over connectivity projects. And that security veto is something that we have to put aside, where we are not able to go ahead with things because, if we open up, terrorists will come in, or if we open up, contraband will come in, bombs may come in. I think we have to be very, very open to the idea of actually connectivity leading to development, which itself helps us in dealing with the security situation. I think there is a different way of looking at border security. And lastly, I would like to point out that with regard to border trade or MFN trade through the border, quite right that the infrastructure in terms of better banking facilities, in terms of having the right kind of warehousing facility, testing facilities for various kinds of goods, they are simply not there. And it is not that they cannot be developed. But the reason why these are not developed, please make no mistake that over a period of time, there is such a vested interest which has actually developed in having informal trade rather than formal trade. There is huge amount of money which is made because of this contraband trade. And those who are involved in that are not, willing to just give that up. And please also do not forget that there is a whole food chain which links political interests in the Northeast with this source of funding which comes from this illegal trade. So even if there is a decision taken that we should have regular trade, MFN trade through the border, to actually operationalize it is proving very, very difficult because of these vested interests. So there is a whole complex of issues that need to be resolved if we can actually leverage this. And, the connectivity aspect, what Vijay has mentioned, how long are you going to be scared about, goods coming in from China or from Thailand? Point well taken. But I think, this is where looking at connectivity, if I may just conclude by pointing out, one, we have been trying to get the government to look at connectivity in a somewhat more comprehensive manner. One is, how do we bring about greater connectivity within the Northeast itself? That is intra-Northeast connectivity. Connecting all the Northeastern, entire region together, knitting it together through the rest of India, which is weak. Let us recognize that it is weak. And here again, there is a security veto. Oh, everything has to go through this narrow, chicken's neck. And, if we are going to develop the infrastructure, this is going to be, very vulnerable. This corridor, actually, what looks on the map as very narrow is actually 22 kilometers broad. If it were in Europe, there would be several railway lines and highways which would be traversing this chicken's neck. So we have deliberately, again, because of this security veto, we have not developed those connections, which we should, because it's very important to develop that, and should be, therefore, in tandem with cross-border connectivity. Because cross-border connectivity, if it is developed, while this connectivity is not properly developed, believe me, you will end up with a situation like we have in northern Myanmar, where most of these states on the periphery are now almost fully integrated with southern China, but are not integrated with the rest of Myanmar. We should not face that kind of a situation in the Northeast. So, although Vijay's point is very well taken, but I think it is important to put it in that context. And in terms of, what we do to develop the Northeast, its own local resources. So transport corridors, yes, but also economic corridors. The complaint that I'm sure Gautam will bear me out, complaint, for example, when I met many of the Northeast chief ministers was, you are treating us as a passageway. As if there is no other importance that we have except to provide you a little passageway, to Myanmar and to Southeast Asia. I think we need to address that. I think that is a valid criticism which is being put forward. And so, how do we, in fact, give the Northeastern states a stake in, developing those connectivity projects? I think that is something which is also very important. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for participating so enthusiastically in this session. Thank you.
Thank you for that summing up, sir.
Thank you, YCS. Thank you, Ashok, for
thank you for that brilliant summing up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Avinash. Thank you,
So
sir.
let's conclude it by thanking all
Thank you, Mr. Avinash, for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for the points and the moderation. Thank you to ICS. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. Thank you.